Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. The Ouija board said it was my future child. Now I'm seeing a little girl in my apartment. I'm not exactly the type of person who believes in supernatural stuff. Ghosts, spirits, demons, all that seemed like stories people told around a campfire or late-night YouTube videos to pass the time. I'd always chuckled at the thought of Ouija boards, considering them nothing more than a marketing gimmick. But last week, something happened that turned my skepticism into a gnawing fear I can't shake. It started as a typical Friday night. My best friend, Jake, who's always the first to suggest the dumbest ideas, convinced a few of us to meet at my apartment. He walked in with his usual grin and an old faded Ouija board tucked under his arm. "Dude, this thing's been in my grandma's attic for like a century," he said, plopping it down on my coffee table. "This is a terrible idea," I muttered. But Jake was already setting it up, and my other friends, Emma and Sam, had pulled up chairs, their expressions half excited, half uncertain. I couldn't let them have all the fun without me, so I joined in, rolling my eyes as we placed our fingers on the planchette. Jake took the lead. "Is anyone here with us?" he said, smirking like he expected someone to leap out and yell, "Boo!" For a while, nothing happened, just the faint hum of traffic from outside and the old clock ticking on the wall. Emma shifted nervously, and Sam let out a bored sigh. And then it moved. Slowly at first, like a spider testing out its legs. We all froze, eyes darting around the table. "Stop pushing it," Emma whispered, but her voice trembled. We each swore we weren't doing it. The planchette slid to YES. The air in the room grew heavy, the kind of silence that presses down on your chest. Jake's grin faded as he glanced up at me, waiting for my cue. I swallowed hard and asked, "Who are you?" The planchette paused, then moved again, faster this time. "YOURFUTURECHILD. Emma gasped, pulling her hand away like she'd been burned. "That's messed up," Sam said, trying to laugh but failing miserably. The planchette kept moving, skittering under our fingertips. HELPME. I felt a chill snake down my spine, and not the overused cliché kind. This was real, cold fear. We stopped, breaking the circle as the planchette went still. Nobody said a word for a solid minute. The tension in the room felt thick enough to cut with a knife. "All right, this is too much," Jake finally said, standing up and shoving the board into its box. "Let's call it a night." We all nodded in silent agreement, relieved to abandon the game and pretend it was just a joke gone too far. But that night, I couldn't sleep. The words, "help me," replayed in my mind like a broken record, accompanied by the strange, almost pleading tone I swore I heard in my head. Around 3 a.m, I got up to grab some water, feeling silly for being so rattled. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or my tired eyes playing games. But there, by the shadow of my living room couch, stood a little girl. She was no more than 6 years old, with tangled dark hair and eyes that seemed too wide, too knowing. She stared at me, unmoving. I blinked, heart pounding as I stepped forward, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. But as soon as I reached the couch, she was gone. Just like that. The silence in the apartment felt almost suffocating. I stood there for what felt like hours, listening to my own shallow breaths, convinced that if I turned around, I'd see her again. But there was only the darkness. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, sitting on my bed with the lamp on and every muscle in my body tensed like a coiled spring. When the sun finally started to rise, I convinced myself it had been a hallucination, a trick of exhaustion mixed with paranoia. Only deep down, I knew that wasn't true. And somehow, I knew it wouldn't be the last time I saw her. The next few days were an exercise in denial. I buried myself in work, hanging out with friends, anything to keep my mind from drifting back to that night. But it's hard to pretend everything's fine when your own home starts to feel like a trap. It began subtly. Objects would move from where I'd left them. A book I'd set on my coffee table would be on the floor when I got back from work, or my keys would vanish and turn up in places I never put them. I chalked it up to forgetfulness at first, but the uneasy feeling never really left me. One evening, after a long day at the office, I came home and noticed something new. My hallway mirror had a faint, child-sized handprint smudged right in the center. I stood there, staring at it, the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. I ran my fingers over the glass, half expecting it to feel cold or sticky. But it was just a smudge, a small, harmless smudge. I convinced myself it was nothing, maybe from a friend's kid who'd visited weeks ago. Yeah, that had to be it. But as I turned away, I swore I heard the faintest giggle, so soft that it felt like it came from the walls themselves. That night, I forced myself into bed, my eyes fixed on the ceiling as the minutes ticked by. I must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing I remember was waking up to the sound of tiny footsteps running down my hallway. I sat up, frozen, my skin crawling as I strained to listen. The footsteps stopped just outside my bedroom door. "Hello?" My voice cracked as it cut through the silence. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, the screen's glow barely pushing back the darkness. I considered calling Jake or Emma just to feel less alone. But what would I even say? Before I could decide, my door creaked open. Just a couple of inches, enough for me to see the shadow standing on the other side. It was her, the little girl. She didn't move or speak, just stood there in the gap, staring with those unnervingly wide eyes. The silence between us felt like a living thing, pressing down on my chest until I couldn't breathe. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper, my voice barely more than a rasp. Her head tilted to one side, and in that moment, I realized she wasn't just staring. She was studying me, like she recognized me. And then, she spoke. Not with her mouth, but with a voice that seemed to echo inside my head, cold and echoing. "Daddy!" The phone slipped from my fingers and clattered onto the floor, breaking the trance. I blinked, and she was gone. The door was still cracked open, but the hallway beyond was empty. I sat there, too stunned to move, my heart thudding so hard it hurt. Sleep was out of the question after that. I spent the rest of the night huddled on my bed, the lamp casting long, jittery shadows across the room. When the first light of morning finally seeped through the blinds, it brought little comfort. The reality of what I'd heard, what she'd called me, left a weight in my chest that no amount of rationalizing could shake. I knew this wasn't just a trick of the mind or a leftover nightmare. Something had latched onto me, something that wasn't going to leave on its own, and deep down, I feared that whatever it was, it wanted more than just to be seen. The morning after I first heard her voice, the exhaustion hit me like a truck. My hands trembled as I poured coffee, the dark liquid splashing over the rim of my mug. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer, each more unsettling than the last. Who was she? Why did she call me Daddy? And more importantly, what did she want? I forced myself through the workday, eyes gritty and unfocused, my co-workers giving me worried glances. I told them I was just under the weather, but the truth was far more complicated. Every time I closed my eyes, even for a second, I saw her face. Those wide, dark eyes staring right into me. That evening I came home to an apartment that felt foreign. The shadows seemed longer, the silence heavier. I hesitated at the threshold, half expecting to hear that faint giggle again, but the apartment remained still. Forcing a deep breath, I stepped inside and locked the door behind me. I hadn't planned on touching the Ouija board again, But desperation does funny things to your judgment. I pulled the box out from under the couch, my hands slick with sweat. It felt heavier than I remembered, as if it carried something far more significant than just a piece of wood and plastic. "If you're here," I whispered, setting the board on the table and placing my fingers on the planchette. "Tell me why." Nothing happened at first, just the low hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the wall clock. But then, slowly, the planchette began to move. I could feel the muscles in my arms tense, every instinct telling me to pull away, to stop. But I didn't. "WATCH," I frowned, confusion mingling with the fear tightening in my chest. "Watch what?" I whispered, my breath hitching. The planchette didn't move again, and I sat back, frustrated and no closer to answers. A sudden chill swept through the room, raising goosebumps on my arms. The lamp flickered, and the soft glow of the bulb cast strange, shifting shadows across the walls. Then I heard it. A whisper, so faint I almost thought I imagined it. "Watch." The voice was soft, childlike, but it came from everywhere and nowhere at once. I spun around, eyes scanning the room, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. The air felt thick, like I was breathing through a wet cloth. Before I could gather my thoughts, the television flicked on, static hissing from the speakers. The screen showed nothing but the grey and black fuzz of dead channels, but buried within the noise, I swore I could see movement. Shapes shifting, figures too quick to catch. Paralysed, I watched as the static twisted into a crude image. A room, my living room, with a figure standing in the corner. The little girl. She turned her head slowly, as if aware I was watching, and then raised a hand to point directly at the screen. The signal sputtered, and the image snapped off, plunging the room back into silence. The silence was short-lived. I heard a knock, 3 slow, deliberate taps from inside the hallway. My throat tightened, and I stood up on shaking legs, every nerve screaming at me to run. But where? This was my home, my supposed sanctuary. Yet here I was, cornered in a place that no longer felt safe. I stepped into the hallway, my eyes adjusting to the dimness. The knock came again, this time right behind me. I spun around, but the corridor was empty. A whisper, low and urgent, brushed against my ear. "Watch." My heart pounded as I backed up against the wall, my vision tunneling with panic. For a brief moment, I saw her, standing at the other end of the hall, just out of reach. Her dark hair tangled, eyes wide and unblinking. She raised her hand and pressed a single finger to her lips. And then she vanished, leaving me with the echo of her whisper and the realization that I was being watched. Not just by her, but by whatever force had invaded my life. The next few days blurred into a fog of sleepless nights and paranoia. Every creak and groan of the apartment seemed magnified, each shadow stretching too far and holding too still. I left all the lights on, no longer caring if the electric bill doubled. But it wasn't enough. The feeling that I was being watched, scrutinized, wouldn't let me go. It was Emma who noticed how haggard I looked when she dropped by unannounced. Her eyes scanned my messy living room, the half-eaten takeout containers and the stacks of coffee-stained mugs. "You look like hell," she said, trying to force a smile. I shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "Just a rough week." "A rough week doesn't make you jump at your own shadow," she said, crossing her arms. "Come on, talk to me." Part of me wanted to spill everything. The girl, the whispers, the knock in the hallway, but saying it out loud made it too real. Instead, I muttered something vague and waved her off. She frowned but eventually left, promising she'd check in again soon. That night, the silence in my apartment felt oppressive. I sat on the couch, remote in hand, mindlessly flipping through channels just to fill the void. The screen glared back at me with a series of sitcoms, news anchors, late-night infomercials. But then, mid-flip, The TV screen went black. My thumb paused on the remote, confusion prickling at my skin. Before I could react, the screen flickered and an old home video began to play. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized the room in the footage. It was the nursery from my childhood home. The walls were painted a soft yellow and a mobile spun slowly above a crib. I could hear a faint lullaby playing, one I hadn't thought about in years. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. The camera panned to the crib, where a baby, me, lay staring up at the spinning mobile, wide-eyed and cooing. The soft sound of my mother's voice hummed in the background, singing along with the lullaby. A pang of nostalgia mixed with dread surged through me. This was impossible. No such video existed. My parents had never owned a camcorder. As the song played, a figure appeared at the edge of the screen, a small, dark-haired girl, barely older than 6. My breath caught in my throat. She stood silently, watching the crib, her eyes wide and somber. And then she turned, looking directly at the camera, at me. Her lips moved, forming a single word. Daddy! The video cut to black, the TV turning itself off with a soft click. The lullaby, however, lingered in the air, as if the room itself was singing. My body locked up, every muscle paralyzed with fear. The shadows in the room deepened, shifting in ways they shouldn't. A faint rustling came from the hallway. I forced myself to stand, my knees nearly buckling as I took a step forward. The hallway stretched before me, dim and quiet. I flicked on the overhead light, the bulb sputtering before holding steady. Nothing, just the stillness of an empty space. I turned back, only to stop dead. She was there, standing in the center of my living room. Her eyes met mine, and this time there was no curiosity in them, only sorrow. Please, her voice echoed, soft and wavering. Help me. Before I could react, she raised her hand and pointed to the Ouija board still sitting on the table. The planchette slid across the surface on its own, spelling out a single word. Remember! The room spun, darkness creeping in at the edges of my vision. Memories I didn't know I had. Fragments of a time I'd buried threatened to rise. And in that moment, I realized with sickening clarity that whatever this was, it wasn't finished with me yet. I sat there, eyes locked on the word remember, spelled out on the Ouija board. The room around me felt colder, like the air had been sucked out. My mind buzzed with fragments of forgotten memories, just out of reach, teasing me with half-formed thoughts. What am I supposed to remember? I whispered, more to myself than to anyone or anything that might be listening. The silence that followed was suffocating, as if the apartment itself was holding its breath. Then the whispers started. Not a voice, but dozens of them, layered and overlapping, seeping from the corners of the room. I pressed my hands to my ears, but it didn't help. The voices weren't just in the room, they were inside my head. Remember, remember. Images flashed behind my closed eyes, a small hand gripping mine, dark curls bouncing as a child ran ahead of me down a sunlit path. Laughter, her laughter, ringing out like a bell. Then darkness, a sudden sharp scream that turned my blood to ice. I stumbled back, hitting the edge of the table, the planchette skittering across the board. The memory was clear now, so vivid it felt like it was happening all over again. Years ago, when I was barely out of college, I'd been in a car accident. The details had always been a blur, the screech of tires, the blinding flash of headlights. But now I remembered. I wasn't alone. A child's seat in the back, the little girl with wide eyes and dark hair reaching out to me, calling for her dad. My breath caught in my throat as the realization hit. She had been there, and I had forgotten her. Or maybe I forced myself to forget. I'm sorry, I whispered, tears stinging my eyes as the truth settled like a weight on my chest. I'm so sorry. The room seemed to respond, the shadows pulling back, the whispers fading into silence. For a moment, there was peace, a brief, fragile calm. And then, the little girl appeared again. But this time she wasn't alone. A woman stood behind her, her features blurred and soft, a warmth in her gaze that felt achingly familiar. "You remembered," the girl's voice echoed, and the corners of her mouth twitched into the faintest smile. The woman placed a hand on the girl's shoulder, and just like that, the room brightened. The oppressive darkness lifted, and the icy chill in the air gave way to something warmer, something that felt almost like forgiveness. I reached out, but before my fingers could touch hers, the image shimmered and dissolved, leaving nothing but the faint scent of lavender and a whisper that felt like a breeze. "Goodbye, Daddy." I stood in the center of my living room, the silence now comforting instead of threatening. The memories were mine again, as painful as they were. The weight of forgetting, of guilt, had lifted, replaced by a bittersweet understanding. The Ouija board sat still on the table, its job done. I closed the box and tucked it away, this time knowing that whatever was haunting me had found peace, and so had I. I asked the Ouija board why I always feel watched in my own house. It said, "Look closer." I never believed in the supernatural, not really. I mean, I enjoyed a good horror movie now and then, but that was as far as my interest went. So, when my roommate Alex suggested we mess around with a Ouija board one evening, I laughed it off. "Come on, dude. You're always saying this stuff is fake," Alex said, smirking as he waved the board in my face. His eyes glinted with a mix of mischief and genuine curiosity. The guy was a walking dare, always looking for something to spice up our otherwise mundane college life. "Fine," I muttered, half annoyed, half intrigued. We set up in the living room, dimmed the lights, and lit a few candles that Alex had found in the cabinet. It was more for effect than anything else, I told myself. Just two guys having fun on a boring Thursday night. What could go wrong? The planchette felt cool under my fingertips, and for a moment, an awkward silence hung between us as we stared at the board. The only sounds were the distant hum of traffic and the occasional creak from the wooden floorboards. "All right, spirits," Alex intoned dramatically. "Are you here?" Nothing happened. Not that I expected anything to. I rolled my eyes and gave Alex a look that said, "Happy now?" He just grinned and pressed on. "Is anyone willing to speak with us?" The planchette twitched. It was subtle. So subtle, I thought I imagined it. But when Alex's eyes widened and met mine, I knew we both felt it. "Are you moving it?" I whispered, my voice coming out harsher than I intended. He shook his head, lips pressed tightly together. We watched, breathless, as the planchette slid across the board, dragging our fingers with it. It stopped on yes. A chill crept up my arms. This was a joke. Had to be. Maybe Alex was trying to spook me, or maybe I was subconsciously pushing it. I told myself that again and again. "Who are you?" Alex asked, his voice now noticeably strained. The planchette moved again, slower this time. It spelled out, "Look closer." I felt a shiver run down my spine. It was such a vague, ominous answer that for a second I debated getting up and ending this whole charade. But I stayed put. Curiosity or stupidity, I wasn't sure which. "What does that mean?" I muttered, half to myself. There was no response, just silence. I exhaled the breath I didn't realize I was holding. The room seemed colder than before. The shadows cast by the flickering candles stretched and warped like dark tendrils across the walls. "All right, that's enough," I said, pulling my hands away. The planchette clattered against the board, a sharp, final sound that felt too loud in the quiet room. "Wait," Alex said, but I had already stood up, brushing off the tingling unease prickling at the back of my neck. I laughed, forced, brittle. "Good one," I said, trying to mask the discomfort creeping through me. "I swear I wasn't moving it," he insisted, his eyes locked on mine. I wanted to argue, to dismiss the whole thing as some shared hallucination or subconscious trick, but something in his expression made me pause. Alex wasn't scared easily, yet there was a genuine edge of fear in his voice. That night, I lay in bed, my room cloaked in the stillness of the early hours. I kept telling myself it was just a game, that whatever happened was either in my head or Alex messing with me. But as I tried to drift off, I felt it. That familiar prickle at the back of my neck. The sensation that someone or something was watching me. I snapped my eyes open, staring at the dark corners of my room. The closet door was ajar, a thin sliver of black peeking out like a silent observer. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. Get a grip, I muttered to myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling. The uneasy silence pressed in around me, heavy and suffocating. Suddenly, the faintest sound broke through. A whisper, barely audible but chilling enough to make my blood run cold. I sat up, straining to listen. It was gone as quickly as it came. But the words that echoed in my head kept me wide awake until morning. Look closer. The next morning, I tried to brush off the previous night as nothing more than exhaustion and an overactive imagination. Alex had already left for work, so the apartment was silent, bathed in the soft light of early morning. But that silence now felt different, like it was charged with something I couldn't put my finger on. I shook my head and pushed the thought away. A hot shower would fix this. I stepped into the bathroom, the cold tile floor stinging my bare feet. As the steam began to fill the room, I caught my reflection in the mirror. My eyes were bloodshot, dark circles smudging the skin beneath them. Great, I muttered, turning on the water. The sound of the shower drowned out the quiet creaks of the old apartment, and for a moment, I felt a fragile sense of normalcy return. That is, until the shower curtain shifted. Just a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. I froze, heart pounding. It could have been a draft. The window was cracked open after all. I took a deep breath, focusing on the rhythmic patter of water hitting the porcelain. Then I heard it. A faint, dry whisper. Look closer. I spun around, pulling the shower curtain aside so fast it nearly tore. Nothing, just the faintest drift of steam escaping into the bathroom, curling up like ghostly fingers. The whisper still clung to the air, almost mocking me. I finished my shower in record time, feeling like an idiot. Clearly, I was psyching myself out over nothing. But as the day wore on, the sense of being watched didn't leave. I felt it when I was making breakfast, when I sat down at my desk to catch up on schoolwork, even when I walked through the living room to grab my phone. The shadows in the room seemed darker, more solid. Every time I glanced at the corner of my eye, I half expected to see movement. By the time Alex came home, the tension was so thick I practically jumped when the front door opened. "Jumpy much?" he said, tossing his keys on the counter. I forced a laugh, trying to sound casual. "Rough day. Did you hear anything weird last night?" He frowned, leaning against the kitchen counter. "Weird how?" "I don't know," I said, rubbing my neck, the same spot that tingled the night before. "Like whispers, or feeling like someone's watching you." Alex's face darkened for a moment, his eyes darting toward the hallway. "Honestly, I haven't been able to shake that feeling either. I thought it was just nerves from last night." He paused, glancing at me with a look that made my stomach twist. "Maybe we should get rid of that board." That night, neither of us felt like playing games or watching TV. The apartment felt off, like the air was too heavy pressing down on us. We went to bed early, both pretending that nothing was wrong. Sleep didn't come easily. I kept my eyes shut tight, willing myself to drift off, but every creak and groan of the old building snapped me back to full awareness. The room seemed darker than usual, the shadows pooling in the corners like ink. It was around 3 a.m. when I woke up to a sound, a low dragging noise, like something being scraped across the floor. I sat up, my pulse pounding so hard I thought I might be sick. The noise stopped. I strained to listen, the silence amplifying every heartbeat, every shaky breath. Then, Just outside my bedroom door, I heard it again, that whisper. Look closer. I didn't move, didn't breathe, my eyes fixed on the small gap under the door. At first, it was just dark, but then I saw something shift. A shadow moved, not fluidly like a person, but with an unnatural, jerky motion. It lingered for a moment, and I swear I saw what looked like fingers, long and thin, dragging across the wood. The shadow vanished, and with it, the heavy silence returned. But I knew I wasn't alone. And now I was certain that whatever it was watching me. By the time morning crept in, the shadows in my room seemed to melt away, taking with them the suffocating fear that had gripped me for hours. But the memory of those long, thin fingers dragging across the floor lingered, haunting me as I tried to shake off the remnants of a sleepless night. Alex knocked on my door, startling me out of my trance. "You okay?" His voice was tense, guarded. "Yeah," I lied, forcing a smile as I opened the door. The truth was written all over his face. He hadn't slept either. The dark rings under his eyes mirrored my own. We stood there for a moment, two exhausted faces with an unspoken understanding. Something was wrong in this apartment. Very wrong. "I heard it again last night," he admitted, rubbing his temples. "The whispers. And something else too. Like scratching." A cold shiver ran down my spine. I didn't need to tell him what I had seen. We both knew that whatever we had invited into our home was no longer playing games. "We need to get rid of that board," I said, my voice trembling. Alex nodded, but his expression shifted from fear to confusion as he turned to the living room. The spot where we had left the Ouija board the night before was empty. "Where is it?" My stomach dropped. We tore the apartment apart, looking in every closet, drawer, and under every piece of furniture. But it was gone, as if it had never been there at all. The day passed in a blur of nervous glances, and a tension so thick it felt like the walls themselves were pressing in. By evening, the unease had settled into a gnawing dread. Alex and I sat in the living room, every light in the apartment blazing, but it did little to chase away the feeling that we were being watched. "What if it's not just the board?" Alex whispered. The thought hung between us, heavy and suffocating. Suddenly, a loud thump echoed from the hallway, like something heavy had fallen. We jumped to our feet, adrenaline spiking. Alex grabbed a flashlight from the table, his hand shaking as he clicked it on. We stepped cautiously into the dark hallway, the narrow beam of light slicing through the shadows. Another noise, this time a low, guttural, scraping sound, came from behind the closed door of my room. My chest tightened as I reached for the handle, every nerve screaming at me to stop. I opened the door, and the flashlight beam wavered as Alex pointed it inside. The room was empty, but the closet door was now wide open, gaping like a mouth. I hadn't left it open, I was sure of that. The air in the room felt thick, charged with an energy that made my skin prickle. "Do you hear that?" Alex whispered. At first, I thought it was the sound of our ragged breathing, but then I realized it was coming from the closet. A faint, rhythmic scratching, like nails dragging across wood. My pulse roared in my ears as I took a hesitant step closer. The scratching stopped. Silence. It pressed against my eardrums, painful in its intensity. Then, without warning, a voice, raspy, hollow, and close enough that I could almost feel the breath on my neck, whispered from the darkness inside the closet. "Look closer." I stumbled back, colliding with Alex. The flashlight slipped from his hand and hit the floor, spinning wildly and casting erratic shadows across the room. For a split second, I saw it. A figure hunched inside the closet, eyes gleaming like polished onyx. It was gone as soon as the light swept over it, but the image burned into my mind. We didn't sleep that night. We didn't talk either. We sat on the couch, wide-eyed and jumpy, every creak of the building setting our nerves on edge. By the time the first rays of dawn seeped through the blinds, I was starting to wonder if we'd ever feel safe again. But deep down, I knew. This wasn't something that would just go away. We had invited it in, and now it was here to stay. The following day, exhaustion weighed on us like a thick blanket. Alex had called in sick, and I skipped my classes, too rattled to pretend everything was normal. We spent most of the day in the living room, flinching at every little noise. Even the sunlight filtering through the blinds didn't seem to cut through the oppressive feeling that clung to the apartment. "What do we do?" Alex finally said, his voice low and strained. I didn't have an answer. Every logical thought was smothered by the memory of that voice and those eyes, gleaming like polished stones in the dark. The fact that we still hadn't found the Ouija board only made things worse, as if it had been swallowed by the very shadows that now felt alive. Afternoon melted into evening, and the apartment grew quieter, almost as if it was holding its breath. I hadn't eaten all day, the knot of anxiety in my stomach keeping hunger at bay. We sat in silence, waiting for something. I didn't know what. Only that whatever it was, it would be bad. Around 8 p.m, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly, a biting chill that made goosebumps rise on my arms. Alex noticed it too. I saw him shiver, eyes darting around nervously. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I knew before I heard it that the whisper was coming back. "Do you hear that?" Alex's voice was barely a whisper. A low hum filled the air, subtle at first, but growing louder. It was a distorted murmur, like a chorus of voices speaking from underwater. The sound slithered through the room, slipping in and out of hearing like a bad signal. It wasn't until it seemed to settle right between us that the words became clear. "Look closer." A sudden crash from the hallway made us both jump. It sounded like glass shattering, but when we peered around the corner, the hallway was empty. The picture frame that had always hung there was on the floor, the glass splintered into jagged shards. But it wasn't the broken frame that made my mouth go dry. It was the message smeared across the wall above it, in a dark, oily substance. "Look closer." "We need to get out of here," Alex said, his voice shaking. He grabbed his jacket and keys without waiting for my response. I didn't argue. My legs felt weak as I followed him to the front door, every step echoing in my head like a countdown. Alex yanked the door open, but the hallway beyond our apartment was different. Darker somehow. The light fixtures overhead flickered, casting long, shifting shadows. The buzzing of the fluorescent bulbs was almost deafening, and the chill from inside seemed to spill out into the corridor. We took a step out and I felt it, a sudden, bone-deep certainty that we were not alone. The hallway felt endless, stretching and warping as we looked down its length. And then I saw them, shapes barely visible at the edge of the flickering light. They moved like static, jittering and disjointed, with eyes that shone in the darkness. Alex stopped dead, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "We need to go back," he whispered. It was a command wrapped in terror, and I obeyed without question. We slammed the door shut behind us and locked it, the noise echoing in the silence that followed. My heart was a drumbeat in my chest as I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. Alex's eyes were wide, his face pale as he stared at me. What did we do? Before I could answer, a sound came from the other side of the door. A soft, deliberate knock. It was so out of place, so polite, that for a second we just stared at each other, too stunned to move. Then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. And from the other side, in that same hollow, raspy voice, we heard it. "Look closer." The knock turned into pounding, the door shaking on its hinges. The lights in the room flickered, and the air crackled with a static charge. Alex and I backed away, unable to tear our eyes from the door. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, pressing down on us like a weight. I glanced at Alex, and in the dim light, I could see it, the reflection in the window behind him. A tall, dark figure, hunched and unmoving, eyes glistening like black mirrors. Watching. "Alex," I croaked, pointing behind him. But when he turned, it was gone. Only the whisper remained, repeating over and over in my head, "Look closer." The silence that followed was heavy, wrapping around us like a smothering blanket. My heart thudded in my chest, each beat like a hammer striking stone. Alex's eyes darted around the room, wide with a fear that mirrored my own. Neither of us dared to speak. The figure, the one I had seen reflected in the window, was burned into my mind, its dark silhouette and gleaming eyes haunting my every thought. "We need to leave," Alex said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, trembling, but firm. I nodded, but even as we moved to pack our things, a deep sense of futility settled over me. This thing, whatever it was, felt like more than just a presence in our apartment. It was in the walls, the air, the very fabric of the place. Leaving might not be enough. We packed in silence, every sound amplified in the tense stillness. The zip of a bag, the rustle of clothes. Each noise seemed to echo, as if the apartment itself was listening. Just as I finished throwing my essentials into a backpack, a strange noise cut through the quiet. A soft, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the hallway. My blood ran cold as I turned to Alex, who had gone pale. He looked at me, eyes wide with unspoken dread. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, turning into a rapid series of knocks that seemed to reverberate through the walls. "Don't open it," I whispered, but Alex was already stepping toward the door, drawn by some unseen force. "We need to see," he said, though his voice wavered with uncertainty. His hand reached for the doorknob, fingers trembling. The moment he touched it, the knocking stopped. Silence fell again, heavy and suffocating. I could hear my pulse in my ears, could see the sweat beading on Alex's brow. He took a deep breath and turned the knob, the door creaking as it swung open. The hallway was empty, a yawning stretch of dim light and shadows. But as we stood there, straining to see any movement, the whisper returned. "Look closer." The voice was behind us. We spun around, and my breath caught in my throat. The room was dark, the lights flickering and buzzing as if they were struggling against an unseen force. In the middle of the living room stood a figure, tall, hunched, its limbs impossibly long and fingers ending in sharp, dark points. The eyes were the worst part, black, bottomless voids that seemed to draw the light into them. Alex stepped back, his face twisted in terror. "What do you want?" he shouted, his voice breaking. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but the room grew colder and the whispers rose again, echoing from every corner. "Look closer." I felt my vision blur, my mind scrambling to make sense of the command. And then, as if a fog lifted, I saw it. The subtle, dark veins snaking up the walls, pulsing as if alive. The whole apartment seemed to shift, the walls stretching and bending, filled with hidden, writhing shapes. Alex stumbled, eyes wide with disbelief. "The board," he said, barely audible. It was never just the board. Before I could react, the figure moved. It didn't walk or lunge, it glided forward, as if the space itself bent to its will. The whispers grew deafening, the static charge in the air making my skin crawl. I couldn't move, frozen by a terror so deep it felt primal. Alex tried to back away, but the figure was on him in an instant. Its long fingers reached out, grazing his shoulder. His eyes rolled back, mouth open in a silent scream as he crumpled to the floor. The room fell silent, the whispers dying out as suddenly as they had started. The figure turned its head toward me, and for the first time, it spoke in a voice that was both familiar and foreign. "You invited me in. Now, look closer." My vision blurred, and I felt a wave of cold sweep over me, dragging me down into darkness. The last thing I saw before everything went black was Alex's body, still and pale, and the glistening eyes of the figure watching me, unblinking. When I woke up, the sun was streaming through the window, casting golden light across the room. Alex was gone. The whispers were gone, but the sense of being watched remained, embedded in my bones. The words echoed in my mind, relentless and haunting. Look closer. We used a Ouija board at a Halloween party. Now everyone who played is seeing the same person in their dreams. All right, so I've never been one to believe in supernatural stuff. You know, ghosts, spirits, all that jazz. It's fun in movies, but in real life? Nah. I'm the guy who'd laugh during a horror film while everyone else was jumping out of their seats. But I swear, what happened last Halloween flipped everything I thought I knew upside down. And before you say anything, yes, I wish this was some made-up story, but it's not. It's as real as it gets. My friends and I are all in our mid-20s, still riding that line between pretending to be adults and holding on to our teenage antics. So last year, we decided to throw a Halloween party at my friend Mark's place, an old, creaky 2-story house that his parents left him when they moved out of state. The place was perfect for the vibe. Flickering candles, fake cobwebs hanging from the ceiling, and eerie music looping in the background. The air smelled like cinnamon and plastic vampire fangs, you know, the typical Halloween mix. About 20 people showed up, all in ridiculous costumes. I was a zombie version of Elvis, don't ask. Mark was dressed as a vampire with fake blood dripping from his fangs, and my best friend Tara came as some sort of twisted doll. The night was going great. Music, drinks, horror movie trivia, until Mark had the bright idea to pull out an old Ouija board he claimed he found in his attic. Come on, it's Halloween. Let's make things spooky, Mark smirked, holding the board up like a prize. You're kidding, right? Tara rolled her eyes, but still couldn't hide the glimmer of curiosity. It was like we were all kids again, daring each other to do something we'd regret. After some egging on, about 8 of us ended up in a circle on the old rug, dimming the lights to just a few flickering candles. The board itself looked ancient, with the letters worn out and smudged. I thought it was probably some cheap replica from the 80s. Boy, was I wrong. We started with the usual jokes. "Is there a spirit here?" Mark asked in a mock spooky voice, wiggling his fingers for added effect. We all laughed. Tara playfully slapped his arm, and nothing happened. The planchette stayed stubbornly still. "It's broken," someone muttered. But just as I was about to agree, the planchette jerked. Not a glide, not a nudge, a full, unmistakable jerk. We all froze, exchanging nervous glances. "Very funny, Mark," Tara whispered, but her voice wavered. "I'm not doing that," Mark said, eyes wide and honest for the first time that night. "Who's here with us?" Someone else, maybe it was Jacob who had been quiet the whole night, asked. The planchette moved, slower this time, spelling out a name that sent a chill down my spine. Damen. The room felt colder. Mark's living room, which had moments ago been filled with laughter, now felt heavy, almost suffocating. I forced a chuckle, trying to break the tension. "All right, Damien, got any party tricks?" I joked, but my voice came out tighter than I intended. The planchette moved again. Beware. I swear to you, it was like the temperature dropped 10 degrees. Tara pulled her hands back, shaking her head. "Nope, I'm out," she said, her usual confidence gone. Before any of us could say anything, a glass shattered in the kitchen. We all jumped, our heads snapping toward the sound. It was just a wine glass that had fallen off the counter, but it was enough to end the game. Mark put the board away, muttering something about bad vibes. We laughed it off, trying to regain the party spirit, but deep down, I think we all felt it. The night had shifted. The weirdness didn't stop there, though. When I finally got home, I was exhausted. I crashed on my bed, still half dressed as zombie Elvis, and fell asleep within minutes. But that night, I had the most vivid dream I've ever experienced. I was back at Mark's house, but it was empty. The rooms were dark except for one flickering light in the living room, and standing there, just out of reach, was a man. He looked wrong. His clothes were torn, his face twisted in a way that made my stomach churn. But it was his eyes that got me, cold, unblinking, and locked onto mine like he could see straight through me. I woke up drenched in sweat, heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I chalked it up to too much beer and Halloween adrenaline. But the next day, when Tara called me, her voice shaky and low, she said, "You're going to think I'm crazy, but did you have any weird dreams last night?" I felt my blood run cold. "Why?" I asked, my mouth dry. "Because I saw him too," she whispered. Tara's words hung in the air like a heavy fog, settling in my chest and making it hard to breathe. She'd seen him too. I tried to steady my voice, but it came out in a shaky whisper. "What did he look like?" "Torn clothes, pale skin, eyes that felt empty," she said, each word more uncertain than the last. I swallowed hard. It was the same man. The room around me, bathed in late morning light, felt suddenly darker. "Did he say anything?" I asked, even though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Number?" "He just stared." Tara's voice cracked. I woke up before anything else happened. We sat in silence on the call, the static crackle filling the spaces where our words should have been. It wasn't just a dream. It couldn't be. Two people having the exact same nightmare about the same stranger. No, something was off. That afternoon, I messaged the others who had been at the party and played with the Ouija board. Most of them brushed me off with dismissive, "Nah man, I'm fine," or "You guys are freaking yourselves out." But then Jacob replied, "Dude, weird you asked." I didn't sleep well, kept waking up thinking someone was in my room. My stomach dropped. 3 of us, all haunted by the same gnawing sense of dread. The logical side of my brain tried to reason it out. Maybe it was a shared reaction, leftover jitters from Halloween, our minds playing tricks. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just some collective coincidence. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow in my room stretched too long. Every creak of the floorboards sounded too deliberate. I left my lamp on and lay awake for what felt like hours. But exhaustion eventually won, and my eyelids grew heavy. I fell into sleep, and there he was again. This time, the dream wasn't just silent and unsettling. It was suffocating. I was back in Mark's living room, but everything was wrong. The walls pulsed like they were breathing, and the room reeked of wet earth and something metallic. Damien stood in the corner, closer than before. His eyes, still locked on mine, glistened with a sick sort of recognition. A grin crept onto his face, slow and unnatural, stretching his features into a grotesque mask. "Why did you call me?" he said, his voice raspy and distant, like wind scraping across gravel. I couldn't speak. I wanted to scream, to run, to wake up, but my body wouldn't move. His eyes darted to my left, and for the first time I realized Tara was standing beside me in the dream. She looked as terrified as I felt. "We need to leave," she said, her voice echoing like we were underwater. The room started shaking, the walls closing in like some twisted version of a haunted house ride. Damien took a step forward, and with that, I jolted awake, gasping for air. My heart thudded painfully against my ribs, and the room around me spun. I glanced at my phone. 3:47 a.m. A message notification glowed on my screen. It was from Tara. "I saw him again. I think he spoke to me." I replied instantly, my fingers trembling so badly I almost dropped my phone. "Me too. What did he say?" 3 dots appeared, then paused. The wait felt eternal. Finally, her message came through. "He asked why we called him." I stared at the screen, cold dread coiling in my gut. This was beyond a nightmare. Whatever we had done that night with the Ouija board had followed us beyond the party. It had seeped into our lives. The next day, I called Mark and Jacob to meet up at a nearby coffee shop. Mark showed up looking like he hadn't slept in a week, dark circles hollowing out his eyes. Jacob was jumpy, glancing over his shoulder every time the door creaked open. "We need to figure this out," I said, my voice low. "This isn't normal. We all saw him." "I thought it was just some stupid dream," Jacob muttered, running his hands through his hair. "But last night, I felt something brush against my leg while I was in bed. I swear, I heard breathing." Mark's expression darkened. "I don't think we can just ignore this." He pulled out his phone and showed us a photo he'd taken of the Ouija board the morning after the party. Scribbled around the edges were symbols none of us recognized, ones that hadn't been there before. I leaned in, a chill spreading through me. What did we wake up? After we left the coffee shop, a thick silence settled between us. The weight of what we'd just uncovered was too heavy to shake off. Mark kept glancing at his phone like it might give him answers, and Jacob's restless energy only seemed to increase. As for me, the unease that had started as a trickle now felt like a flood threatening to swallow me whole. By the time I got home, the sun was already beginning to dip behind the horizon, casting long, claw-like shadows across the walls. I turned on every light in the house, hoping it would make the creeping dread subside. It didn't. The corners of each room seemed darker than before, like they were holding their breath, waiting. That night, the dream came back, more vivid than ever. I was in my bedroom, but it was twisted. The furniture warped, the air thick like syrup. I tried to move, but my limbs felt anchored. Damien stood at the foot of my bed, closer than before. His grin was gone, replaced by an expression that made my skin crawl, a mix of anger and amusement, like he was testing the waters of how far he could go. "You shouldn't have called," he whispered, the voice surrounding me as if it seeped from the walls. My heart pounded so hard, I thought it would shatter my ribs. I tried to speak, to scream, but my throat locked tight. His eyes, those hollow, lifeless eyes, shifted to the side, and I realized with a jolt that Tara was in the room again, sitting paralyzed in the corner, her eyes wide and glistening with tears. "Make it stop," she mouthed, the words silent but desperate. The floorboards creaked under Damien's feet as he moved. Each step echoed like a drumbeat, louder and louder, until I couldn't take it anymore, and then I woke up. My body jolted upright, drenched in sweat, the sheets tangled around me like a trap. The digital clock on my nightstand blinked 4:13 a.m. I wiped my face and forced myself to breathe, each inhale shuddering like I'd just surfaced from drowning. The next day, Tara and I met up at her apartment. She looked pale, dark circles under her eyes like bruises. We didn't even need to speak to know we'd seen the same thing again. Instead, we sat in her kitchen, the hum of the fridge, the only noise breaking the silence. "It's not just a nightmare," she finally said, her voice hoarse. "It's him. He's real." I nodded, the fear in my chest tightening. "We need to find out what those symbols mean," I said, remembering the photo Mark had shown us. Tara pulled out her laptop, fingers flying over the keyboard as she searched through forums and paranormal websites. Page after page scrolled by, filled with conspiracy theories, half-baked explanations, and stories that sounded too far-fetched even for us. But then we found something, an old grainy blog post from 2009, written by someone who claimed to be a paranormal researcher. The symbols on Mark's Ouija board matched those in the post, described as markings of a summoner's mistake. A set of glyphs that supposedly tied a spirit to the physical world until its purpose was fulfilled. The author warned that these mistakes often happened during amateur Ouija sessions, especially when the participants mocked or didn't take the ritual seriously. "Oh my God," Tara whispered, scrolling to a line that made my blood run cold. If the spirit speaks directly to the summoners, it means it has attached itself and will seek closure by any means necessary. My phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a message from Jacob. "Guys, I need help. I saw him in my house when I was awake." Tara and I exchanged a look that said it all. We were out of our depth. We grabbed our jackets and left without another word, the chill outside doing nothing to chase away the growing cold gnawing at my insides. When we arrived at Jacob's place, the lights were on in every room, the curtains drawn tight. He opened the door, eyes wild and frantic, like he hadn't slept in days. "He was here," Jacob said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I saw him standing at the foot of my bed, just staring. I'm not going crazy, am I?" "No," I said, forcing my voice to stay calm even as my hands shook. "We need to end this." But how do you end something you don't understand? Something that might not even belong in the world of the living? As the night crept on, the shadows seemed to stretch and shift, as if listening. And somewhere deep in the quiet of Jacob's house, I swore I could hear the faintest echo of Damien's voice. "Why did you call me?" Jacob's house felt like a cage. The walls seemed to close in, thick with the scent of stale air and fear. We sat in his dimly lit living room, huddled close like kids telling ghost stories. Except this wasn't make-believe. The silence between us was heavy, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards or the distant hum of traffic outside. Every sound made us flinch. "He's getting stronger," Jacob said, his eyes darting to the dark corners of the room. "I know it sounds insane, but I feel him even when I'm awake." His voice was barely a whisper, as if speaking louder might invite Damien in. Tara's hands were clenched so tight her knuckles had turned white. "We can't just sit here and wait for him to come to us," she said, her voice trembling. "We need to do something. Anything." Mark, who had been pacing back and forth like a caged animal, finally stopped and looked at us. "I read somewhere that if you break the connection, the spirit loses its hold." He ran a hand through his hair, eyes wild. "Maybe if we destroy the board, it'll end this." A shiver raced down my spine. Destroying the Ouija board felt reckless, like slamming a door shut on something that might already be halfway through it. But what choice did we have? I nodded, feeling the weight of the decision settle in my chest. "Where's the board now?" Jacob asked. "In my attic," Mark said. "I hid it after the party." We didn't waste any time. The four of us piled into Mark's car, the drive back to his house eerily quiet. The dark streets seemed emptier than usual, the streetlights casting long, jagged shadows that danced at the edges of my vision. When we pulled up to Mark's house, it loomed over us, the old wood creaking like it was alive and waiting. The attic door was stuck, as if resisting us, but Mark yanked it open with a grunt. The smell of dust and mildew rushed out, making me cough. We climbed the ladder one by one, the small space above dimly lit by the single bulb that swung precariously from the ceiling. There it was, the Ouija board, half hidden under a pile of old newspapers. Just seeing it made my stomach twist. Mark picked it up with hesitant hands, his fingers brushing the worn wood like it might bite him. For a moment, nothing happened, but then a sudden sharp knock echoed from downstairs. We froze. The knock came again, louder this time, and my heart slammed against my chest. Tara's eyes were wide, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. "Who the hell is that?" she whispered, the words barely making it past her lips. "Stay here," Mark said, though his voice cracked on the last word. He handed the board to me before climbing back down the ladder. We listened as his footsteps creaked across the floor, followed by the groan of the front door opening. Silence. And then, a scream. I bolted down the ladder with Tara and Jacob on my heels. Mark stood in the open doorway, staring out into the night with eyes so wide they looked like they might pop out of his head. I followed his gaze and felt the blood drain from my face. Daman was standing at the edge of the driveway, illuminated by the harsh glow of the streetlight. His body was still, but his eyes locked on us, empty and cold. The grin was back, stretched too wide, like it was carved into his face. "Why did you call me?" The voice echoed in my head, louder this time, as if it were coming from inside my skull. The world seemed to blur at the edges, the streetlight flickering as if it might go out any second. "Close the door!" Tara shouted, yanking Mark back inside. The door slammed shut, the sound reverberating through the house. We stumbled into the living room, our breaths coming in panicked bursts. "We need to end this now," I said, holding up the board. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep hold of it. "Fire," Jacob said suddenly. "We need to burn it." Without another word, Mark grabbed a lighter from the table and nodded toward the fireplace. The flames roared to life as we tossed the board in, the wood crackling and hissing like it was alive. For a moment, nothing happened. Just the normal sound of fire consuming wood. But then, a low, guttural growl filled the room, vibrating through the floor and into my bones. The flames flared up, turning an unnatural shade of blue before dying down, just as suddenly. The silence that followed was suffocating. "Is it over?" Tara whispered, her voice so fragile it could break. But deep down, I knew better. The house felt different, heavier. And in the corner of the room, where the shadows met, I could swear I saw Daman's grin, fading slowly into the dark. The silence after the fire died out was suffocating. We stood there, breaths shallow and eyes wide, like we were waiting for the world to end. The room still hummed with the aftermath of whatever we'd just done. The crackling of the dying flames was the only sound, and even that seemed muted, like the house itself was holding its breath. "Did it work?" Jacob asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Before anyone could answer, a sudden chill swept through the room, extinguishing the remnants of the fire and plunging us into near darkness. The temperature dropped so fast that I could see my breath puff out in front of me. Tara's eyes met mine, wide and full of fear. We all felt it. Daman wasn't gone. A loud thud came from upstairs, making us all jump. It was followed by slow, deliberate footsteps, each one creaking with a purpose. They were coming closer. I felt my muscles lock up, frozen between fight and flight. "What do we do?" Tara said, her voice cracking as she clutched my arm. Mark grabbed a flashlight and aimed its weak beam toward the stairwell. The footsteps stopped, but the silence was worse. Every nerve in my body was screaming for me to run, to get out, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the floor. "We can't stay here," Mark finally said, breaking the silence. The flashlight beam shook in his hand as he took a cautious step toward the stairs. And then we heard it. A low, raspy laugh, echoing down from above. It was unmistakable. Daman. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. The laugh grew louder, like it was surrounding us, pressing in from all sides. "Get out," I said, pushing Tara toward the front door. Jacob followed, eyes darting around like he expected Daman to leap out of the shadows at any second. Mark hesitated, flashlight still trained on the stairwell. "Mark, let's go!" Tara shouted, her voice sharp with panic. But before he could move, the door to the attic slammed open, sending a gust of icy wind down the stairs. In that moment, I saw him. Daman stood at the top, half in shadow, his grin wider than before, eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. He didn't move, just stared, that same haunting gaze piercing right through me. Mark took a stumbling step back, the flashlight slipping from his fingers and clattering to the floor. The beams spun wildly, casting jagged shapes across the walls. Daman's grin seemed to shift, as if he was savouring our fear. "Run!" Jacob yelled, and that was enough to break whatever spell held us. We bolted out the front door, the cold night air biting at our faces. We didn't stop running until we reached the street, gasping for breath and shivering, not just from the chill, but from the realization that whatever Damien was, he was far from finished. The next few days were a blur. Mark stayed with Jacob, refusing to go back to his house. Tara and I barely spoke, each haunted by the memories of that night and the gnawing dread that it wasn't over. Every shadow felt too deep, every noise too sharp. I slept with the lights on, but even that wasn't enough to chase away the nightmares. Then the messages started. It began with Tara. A simple text at first. "Did you call me?" Followed by another one moments later. "Never mind." It was nothing. Then Mark. My phone just played a voicemail, but there was no number. It was him laughing. My own phone buzzed one night, waking me from a restless sleep. The screen lit up with an unknown number. I didn't answer. I couldn't. But when the voicemail alert appeared, I felt my blood run cold. I pressed play, my hand shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. The recording was nothing but a whisper, so faint I could barely make it out. But I knew what it said, even before I heard the words clearly. "Why did you call me?" We never found a way to break the connection. We never discovered what Damien really wanted or why he came. But he stayed with us, in the dark, in our dreams, in every shadow that crept too close, and I think he always will.